What we have is 14,000 copies of the New Testament of the Bible that are 99.5% the same, spread out over the first few centuries of the church. That is impossible, historically speaking. Especially given the speed and the spread of the gospel, there is zero logical explanation for the fact that that happened. There's not another book like it, which begs the question, how did that happen? People ask the question, can I really trust the Bible? Or is the Bible that we have just kind of more like a game of telephone? And that would matter, wouldn't it? If we played telephone right now, like if I walked off the stage and I whispered, I saw Sam sipping soda by the seashore, and I made you all whisper that and a snake around this room, there's a 0% chance that phrase gets back to me, right? So is that the Bible? Has it just been changed over time? Have people added stuff that they thought should be added, taken out stuff they didn't think should be added? Have people in power kind of warped it to give them more power? That's the Da Vinci Code theory, right? Like, is what we have what they actually wrote? And is what they wrote stuff that actually happened? And is any of that actually still relevant to our lives? Because if we're going to build our futures on it, if we're going to put our faith in it, if we're going to stake our eternity on the words in that book, it matters that we can trust it. And so there's so much more that I can cover this morning. I'm going to talk even faster than usual because I'm going to cram as much of it as I possibly can in. But I'm going to give a high-level overview, all right? So to start with the question of whether it's intellectually defensible and coherent to believe in the Bible, we can actually apply some academic metrics that literary critics or textual critics use whenever they approach a work of literature, particularly from antiquity. And a couple key questions they ask are, is it textually reliable and is it historically reliable? Which is to say, number one, is the text that we have similar to the original documents that the authors wrote? Like, how close is what we're reading to what they wrote? And then number two, is this stuff that actually historically happened, or is it just fairy tales that were fabricated somewhere along the way? And over the last few years, there's been this massive movement, and a number of atheist scholars have tried to say that the New Testament text that we have is mostly just an amalgamation of a bunch of people's ideas over a bunch of different centuries. And at this point, it's like maybe 20% what the original authors wrote. These guys, Marcus Borg, Robert Funk, and Paul Verhoeven, started this thing called the Jesus Seminar, where they talk about the parts that they think might not be actual. And the thing is, they do dislike the Bible, but they are not Bible scholars. Paul Verhoeven is most famous for being the director of such Hollywood classic hits as RoboCop and Showgirls. So, like, grain of salt on what those guys think. However, there's a guy named Bart Ehrman who is an expert. He's a brilliant biblical scholar. He studied under some of the greatest New Testament exegetes alive today. And over the recent past, he has gone on TV and on podcasts and a whole bunch of other places to talk about his book, Misquoting the Bible, or Misquoting Jesus, Who Changed the Bible and Why. And in his book, a New York Times bestseller, Ehrman advances a couple of different arguments about why the New Testament text is untrustworthy. He says, we don't even have the original letters that were written. And he's right about that. We not only don't have the copies, we don't even have the first copies of those copies. They were written on papyrus, which is kind of the texture of a paper grocery bag. Imagine passing that around for hundreds of years. It's gone, baby. Ehrman also argues that of the manuscripts we have, they're not the same. There's like a whole bunch of differences between them. And once again, he's completely right. And therefore, he would say, we have to treat the New Testament as a fabrication, cobbled together over time. And if you didn't know any better, or if you didn't know that Bart Ehrman actually knows better, but there are entire scholarly arguments that he intentionally omits from his book because they aim in a different direction than the conclusion he'd like you to make. Like if you're sitting in a lecture hall and you heard a professor say that stuff, or if you're sitting at coffee and a friend said it who heard it from a professor or a podcaster, it's a little bit jarring, isn't it? Like that's a jarring thought, and it's unmoored a lot of people from the foundation of their faith. Too many. And I say too many because it's an intentional deception that has taken hold in our culture. So hold on to your hats. Here's where we nerd out hard. Text criticism, not just of the Bible, but of all ancient literature, from the Iliad to the Atrahasis to Beowulf, has three primary benchmarks to determine how accurate the source material in hand is to the source material that was originally written. And those benchmarks are accuracy of the text, like variance in manuscripts. How precisely does every copy that we have match up with one another? Because the closer they are together, the more accurately we can reconstruct an original. The second benchmark is number of manuscripts. How many copies of this book do we have? The more, the merrier. And the third one is the timing of manuscripts. Specifically, what's the earliest copy we have? Like, how close is it to when the original author lived and died? And how spread apart are the manuscripts that we have? Because the shorter that timeline, like the closer they are to when the original author lived, and the closer they are together, probably the more accurately we can reconstruct what was originally written. And that adds up. So let's put the Bible under the microscope. When it comes to variance, Bart Ehrman says we cannot trust the New Testament version of the Bible because it has more textual variance than it has words. And he's not wrong. Again, he's got us on that one by a lot. There are 138,162 words in the Greek version of the New Testament. Write that down. That's on the pop quiz next week. 138,162. And among those 138,162 words spread out across all the manuscripts we have in the New Testament, there are a little over 400,000 differences. That feels like a big number, doesn't it? It's kind of like, whew, that's a lot. That's maybe more than I thought there would be. But a couple thoughts. A, it's not nearly as much as you'd think when dealing with ancient literature, because before Gutenberg invented the printing press, all of it had to be copied by hand. I don't know how many of you have ever read elementary school kids' handwriting, but handwriting is an inexact science, all right? We'll double back to that later. But B, what those differences are matters quite a bit. Like, are they significant differences? Did they change the meaning? Did they change the interpretation? Or do they not? For example, John, a name that gets affixed to 4 different books of the Bible, John, 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, has what is in Greek known as the movable nu. Nu is the Greek letter N. It looks like a V. Don't worry about that. But you can write Evangelion, kata, Iohanen, with 2 nus at the end, or 1 nu. Just like in English, they spelled John 2 different ways. And in the manuscripts we have, they spell John 2 different ways. But I'm unconvinced that means we can't trust the book. Like, how can we even read the rest of John? They don't even know what his name was. Well, everyone knows what his name was. He was a Jewish guy named Yochanan. But when the Greeks translated Yochanan into Greek, they spelled John 2 different ways. Now, riddle me this. You won't find the answer in Bart Ehrman's book. What number of the 400,000 differences among manuscripts in the New Testament do you think are simple spelling differences or spelling errors where a scribe wrote the wrong letter? Over 280,000 of them. That knocks out 70% of the differences in the manuscripts. But what about the other 30%? Great question. I'm really glad that you just asked that question. Greek's a really interesting language that sometimes doesn't add up in our English brains. It's what we call a highly inflected language. And that means that the word endings change to convey meaning. If you've ever taken a foreign language in school, Spanish, German, French, you know that we conjugate verbs, and verb endings tell us what we're talking about. Well, in a highly inflected language, we conjugate every part of speech. So in Greek, that means you could write Jesus loves Mike in literally any order. Jesus, Mike loves Mike, Jesus, Mike. And it all means Jesus loves Mike because the suffixes affixed to the words tell us what the object is, what the subject is, and what the point is. It changes absolutely nothing about the interpretation of the text, and it confuses absolutely no one because that's how highly inflected languages work, even in the world today. What percentage do you think of the 400,000 differences are word order changes? A little over 29%. 99.5% of what's written across all the manuscripts we have in the New Testament has 0 textual variance in between it at all. At all. But that leaves 0.5%, right? There are some things that are absolutely different. They just simply don't match up, and they do change the meaning. For example, 1 Thessalonians 2:7. Paul's talking about what happened when he showed up at the church at Thessalonica, and he writes, "We became gentle among you, agonathimen apioi." Now, we have some manuscripts that change one vowel and say, agonathimen hipioi. We became horses among you. Now, bear with me on this. Most of the time when that happens, and then one manuscript changes and a whole bunch of subsequent manuscripts changes, it's not a real brain buster to guess which one might have been accurate and where we got offline. Like, other than whether the mark of the beast is 666 or 616, if you want to go on a really weird wormhole, talk to me later about that. I'm not going to talk to everyone about that. But, all right, most of the time we can be like, I don't know, what do we think Paul wrote? What sounds more like Jesus, becoming gentle or becoming a horse? I mean, that's a big theological difference. If we show up at church and we just become horses, some of you would be fired up about that. I would quit coming. I don't like animals. But like I don't know, tomato, horses, gentle, Jesus. Like, it's not that confusing, even to guys like Bart Ehrman who would like you to believe that he's confused. And not only that, what we have to understand about this text of the Bible is that it is absolutely unique in the history of the world. From antiquity only the Iliad cracks 90% accuracy. Across 643 copies that are spread out over, we have no idea how many years. You get to Thucydides, Herodotus, Plato, Aristotle, Caesar. I've read all those guys. Like, I actually realized while putting on my socks this week that my copy of Plato's Republic is sitting on my dresser. We have less than 10 copies of every single one of their books. The earliest copies we have come from over 1 millennium after they were dead, and all the copies we have are spread out over at least 900 years, which means we don't have enough copies to even reconstruct the original because of all the differences between the few copies we have. So I have no idea how accurately that book sitting on my dresser reflects what Plato really wrote about his political philosophy. But the New Testament, we have 14,000 copies of the New Testament. The earliest one is called P52. It stands for papyrus. P52. It was discovered at a library in Manchester accidentally by a kid named Colin. Colin was looking through some ancient documents. He found this little codex and he said, holy smokes, that looks like John 18. And so he took it to some experts, some paperologists. I don't know if that's what they're called, all right, but bear with me, like paper experts, and they dated the papyrus and they said, you gotta be kidding me. That's from the 1st century. Like that papyrus is likely from 90 AD. And that's the day Colin exploded an entire vein of European biblical text criticism. Because there was these Hegelian-influenced dudes who were like, okay, well, Hegel taught us that history marches on like a dialectic. There's thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And the Bible can't be true, so how do we read this into the Bible? Well, when it comes to Christianity, clearly Peter was early. Mark was dictated by Peter. Peter is the thesis. And then Paul is the antithesis. And then the book of Acts, and specifically the Gospel of John, are the synthesis. And so there's no way that John could have been written until like almost at the earliest 200 AD. And then Colin found a copy of it from 90 AD. And a lot of those guys' books didn't sell anymore. Thanks, Colin. Like 90 AD, less than 60 years after Jesus had been crucified and risen again. And Colin found just a fragment, but we have these entire giant codices, Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, that are early, that are in the first few centuries BC. What we have is 14,000 copies of the New Testament of the Bible that are 99.5% the same, spread out over the first few centuries of the church. That is impossible, historically speaking. Especially given the speed and the spread of the gospel. There is zero logical explanation for the fact that that happened. There's not another book like it, which begs the question, how did that happen? Like, why did that happen? And even excluding the idea that maybe, just maybe, there's a metaphysical reason and the God of the universe had a hand in that. It happened because the church believed the message mattered so much that it ought to be conveyed accurately. God's people have always believed that. In Deuteronomy 4:2, God said, do not add to what I command you and do not subtract from it, but keep the commandments of the Lord your God that I give you. In Revelation 22:18 and 19 says, I warn everyone who hears the words of the prophecy of this scroll. If anyone adds anything to them, God will add that person to the plagues described in this scroll. And if anyone takes words away from the scroll of this prophecy, God will take away from that person any share in the tree of life and the holy city, which are described in this scroll. It has always mattered to God's people to pass along the message as it was written, inspired by God, to make sure that the next generation and the next generation and the next generation hear it accurately.